Hi, everybody. Today is Wednesday, April 9th, 2025, and our friends, Ambassador Chas Freeman and Colonel Wilkerson, and our new friend, Trita Parsi, for the first time on this channel. Welcome.
Glad to be here.
Good to be with you.
Let's get started, Ambassador, with what's going on, with what has happened in the meeting between Donald Trump and Netanyahu. And here is what they were talking about, the way that they were addressing Iran in that meeting.
Iran, look, we're both united in the goal that Iran does not ever get nuclear weapons. If it can be done diplomatically in a full way, the way it was done in Libya, I think that would be a good thing. But whatever happens, we have to make sure that Iran does not have nuclear weapons. That's the end of my speech.
Mr. President, we're having direct talks with. Wait. We're having direct talks with Iran, and they've started. It'll go on Saturday. We have a very big meeting, and we'll see what can happen. And I think everybody agrees that doing a deal would be preferable to doing the obvious, and the obvious is not something that I want to be involved with, or frankly, that Israel wants to be involved with if they can avoid it. So we're going to see if we can avoid it. But it's getting to be very dangerous territory. And hopefully those talks will be successful. And I think it would be in Iran's best interest if they are successful. We hope that's going to happen.
Ambassador, what does Netanyahu want, and what does Donald Trump want to deliver to them?
Well, I think it's fairly easy to figure out what Netanyahu wants, which is he wants to reduce Iran to the level of Syria. That is, he wants to disarm it. He wants regime change. He wants to basically leave Iran with only nominal sovereignty in a Western Asia that is dominated by Israel. That is the objective. There's a certain irony, of course, in this discussion. Iran must never get a nuclear weapon because, of course, Israel did acquire nuclear weapons clandestinely while lying to the American president, John F. Kennedy, and subsequently Lyndon Johnson. And he did so by stealing nuclear material from the United States and applying French technology to that. So we're talking about preventing Iran from doing something that Israel has done. And yet no one raises the demand that Israel reverse its nuclear program. The final irony is, of course, that the National Intelligence Estimate recently released reaffirmed the judgment of the intelligence community here, which I gather is shared by Mossad in Israel, that Iran has not made a decision to build a nuclear weapon, although it is advancing its capacity to make that decision if that is necessary. And finally, of course, Mr. Trump characterized the talks as direct. He's sending Mr. Witkoff to Oman for talks. Foreign Minister Araghchi from Iran has described the talks as indirect. I very much hope that they become direct, because I think Mr. Witkoff needs to confront Iran directly and hear directly from Iran what its position is. And I think the same is true of Mr. Araghchi. He needs to size up Mr. Witkoff, who is, after all, a diplomatic novice, an intelligent real estate developer, a wealthy man, a friend of the president, but very much a novice in the diplomatic area, with so far no successes to his name. No ceasefire in Ukraine, no ceasefire that held in Palestine, and yet he's off to try to reach some kind of understanding with Iran. Probably, as a further irony, basically a new version of the JCPOA. That is the nuclear deal that Mr. Trump himself torpedoed. If I were Iran, I would wonder why a new deal would have any standing at all in Mr. Trump's eyes. So I think this is quite risky, and the risks are too great to have the talks remain indirect, in my view.
Trita, why is Iran insisting on indirect talks instead of direct talks?
I think the Iranians are insisting on indirect talks because they're treating direct talks as essentially a carrot, and as well as a protection for themselves. They want to see what are the parameters from the American perspective, what is on the table, what is not on the table, and are the parameters such that a deal actually can be reached? Because if the parameters are what Bibi said in this clip that you showed, which is a Libya model, those are not acceptable parameters for the Iranians and for anyone. I mean, given what happened to Muammar Gaddafi, the idea of talking about the Libya model as if it's an attractive thing for the other side is like for the Iranians to talk about that they want to see the Pearl Harbor model or something like that. It's completely ludicrous, of course. And if it is such, they don't want to engage in direct negotiations, partly to say diplomacy has not been exhausted and it's illegitimate because they fear that if that is the premise, that the goal is to go towards military action. But if the parameters are acceptable, that there actually is a basis in which both sides have a decent confidence that this can lead to a deal, then I think it would be very foolish of the Iranians not to engage directly. Chaz is absolutely right that it doesn't make any sense. And by the way, there's no need for them to talk indirectly if they're sitting in Oman. They can talk indirectly through Omanis or others while sitting in Washington and in Tehran. And there's absolutely no need for the top diplomat of Iran, Araghchi, to go only to engage indirectly. I think the mere fact that he is going is an indication that the Iranians have enough information and enough indications that the parameters may end up being quite acceptable and constructive, that they are willing to elevate this to direct talks already on Saturday. I don't see other reason as to why Araghchi himself would have gone. But let me also say just something about the clip that you said. It's very interesting. I don't recall Netanyahu saying that the goal is to prevent an Iranian nuclear weapon. The Israeli line has been the goal is to prevent an Iranian nuclear weapons capability, which means essentially that Iran can have no nuclear program at all, even a civilian one. Here he changed his language a little bit, and I think he didn't do it intentionally. I think he ended up doing it because he was off balance, because he came to Washington not knowing what the agenda was. He thought he was going to talk about tariffs. Instead, it's only when he arrives in Washington that he's informed that the US is actually going to talk to the Iranians on Saturday. And I think it threw him off balance, and he ended up not being able to stick to his usual talking points. Moreover, if you take a look at the basket of issues that were being discussed in that press conference, which I assume is reflective of what was talked behind the scenes, it was Turkey, it was Iran, it was tariffs, it was Gaza. Of those four, only Gaza was a constant. No one had any expectation or desire to change it there. Unfortunately, I would have loved for Trump to change his position on Gaza. But on all other three, Netanyahu had the opportunity to make gains. And on all three, he made no gains. Instead, he had Trump sitting next to him praising Erdogan and then turning to Netanyahu and say, and you better be reasonable, which is the opposite of what Netanyahu was hoping to hear. On tariffs, he got nothing. And on the nuclear issue, there was no confirmation publicly or privately that Trump is going to adopt the Libya model, the complete dismantlement of the Iranian nuclear program. And in fact, what Witkoff has been saying publicly, he's been talking about a verification-based deal, which is essentially what the JCPOA also was. So I think Netanyahu walked home very, very disappointed. And I think it is an indication, perhaps premature to be too optimistic, but an indication that if Trump really wants a deal, which I suspect he wants, he does have the capacity and the willingness to put pressure on Netanyahu in a manner that Biden never did.
Larry, go ahead.
Well, I identify myself with the previous remarks in the main. Let me do a little history for you, though, for a second. You know, what Ambassador Freeman said, I agree with today, but I didn't once agree with it. When Israel was a state that was basically a liberal democracy, despite the repercussions that occasionally occurred with regard to the Palestinians and ourselves. And when our presidents like H.W. Bush in particular, or Ronald Reagan, were willing to bring the hammer down on Israel from time to time when they got out of line, as a military officer at the time serving the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, I felt Israel's right to a nuclear weapon was justified. They lived in a very dangerous place. They were our emissary, if you will, in the Levant. They were looking after our interests in West Asia, and therefore they were okay with the nuclear weapon. That was my position as a military professional. Today, I agree with the ambassador completely, because they have proven that they are none of those things, at least in evolution, if not originally too, that I thought they were. Therefore, that point is solidly made by the ambassador that there is no reason whatsoever that Israel has a right to stand up and pontificate about Iran's potential to get a nuclear weapon when they're sitting on one, or a couple of hundred, as I understand it. My second point is more positive, I think, and that is that yesterday, you'll recall, I was convinced that we were headed for war. 90% convinced we were headed for war. In the last 24 hours, I've been updated, as it were, and I think we are in some serious negotiations, as I thought all along when Trump first started talking about this, because I thought he wanted to deal. He didn't want a war, he wanted to deal. No, the Pentagon's telling him, even with Hegseth there, fundamentally a sycophant, that it would be a disaster if we had a ground war in Iran. And even the nuclear facilities might not be destroyed in the way we want them to, with constant air power. So that's the second thing. The third thing is, I think he's got a real good chance of succeeding if what the ambassador and Trita said transpires. If we actually get direct talks, and he has negotiating leverage, if you will, which is what I think the Houthis were all about, and all the other talk, the braggadocio, and the I'm going to bomb you back to the Stone Age, that sort of thing. I think there's a chance of a deal here. I didn't think that yesterday. You know, I did think that before yesterday, and then I fell off of that because what I was hearing and seeing, and what I was hearing particularly from the Pentagon and the preparations therefore. Now, with a 24-hour gap between what I said to you yesterday and now, informed by the ambassador and by Trita too, more so now, I think there is a good chance we might have a deal. And that might be the end of this. And I agree, Ambassador Freeman and I were talking about this before we came on air. I think Trump detests Netanyahu. And I love the way he dealt with him in the Oval Office.
He was a little more gentle.
Yeah.
A little more gentle than he dealt with Zelensky, I would say. You know, I think really, Larry, this is a test of the Trump administration as much as anything. We have Mike Waltz and others putting forward maximal demands on Iran. Eliminate your missiles, disarm, do away with your peaceful nuclear program, or else. And yet we have Witkoff saying something different. And I think Mr. Trump does want a deal, but I'm not convinced that his subordinates, Mario Rubio or Mike Waltz or the others, agree with him on this. And so which way is he going to turn? He's pretty erratic. I think, you know, there is the possibility still that Doug McGregor is correct, in which he's analogized the ultimatum to Iran to the Austro-Hungarian Empire's ultimatum to Serbia after the Sarajevo assassination of the Grand Duke. 10 points on non-negotiable demands. The Serbs accepted 9. They did not accept the 10th, and the Austro-Hungarians went to war. So the whole point was not to set off a negotiation, but to provide a justification for aggression. And I note, and I'm sure, Larry, you're much better informed on this than I, but I believe that pretty much our entire tanker fleet has now gone with a very substantial number of B-2 bombers to Diego Garcia, precisely because the B-2 is the only aircraft that can drop a 30,000-pound bunker-busting bomb that might have some hope of injuring, if not eliminating, the Iranian underground facilities that are involved in the nuclear program. So the gun is, the trigger is cocked, you know. And so I hope you're right, and I hope Trita is right, and that we end up with a negotiation. But again, I come back to the point that the Iranians have had a lot of experience with American negotiators, and their conclusion is that we don't keep our word. We go back on it very easily. So there we are.
Can I say something about that? Because I think, I mean, Chaz, you're absolutely right, of course. And during the Biden years, one of the big sticking points was that the Iranians wanted some form of a guarantee that the sanctions relief that would be offered in return for Iranian concessions would be sustainable and would not be reversed as soon as the next president came in. And originally, the Biden administration's position, lo and behold, was that they didn't even guarantee that they would sustain the sanctions relief. Forget about what the next president would do. So you can just imagine how hollow and meaningless that concession was. That changed afterwards, partly because it became public. And then the problem was that they could only guarantee it essentially for their own term, and made the argument, which I thought was the worst possible selling point for democracy. We're saying that because we are a democracy, we cannot guarantee that we will keep our promises. And doing that at a moment in which they were, of course, dividing the world between democracies and autocracies as the organizing principle for the world. That's the worst marketing strategy for democracies. The Iranians seem to have come to the conclusion that the best way of actually overcoming the challenges that exist now because of a very divided American political system and a very limited capacity for the politicians to stick to promises beyond elections is to actually open up the Iranian market for American businesses. This has now been spoken about quite a lot in the Iranian media. You have even the IRGC channels coming out and saying that they're welcoming limited American investments in Iran. You have the op-ed by Foreign Minister Araghchi yesterday in the Washington Post talking about how it's US sanctions that have prevented Iran businesses to come into Iran. It's not that the Iranians want a closed economy, and he talks about $1 trillion opportunity for American businesses that has been denied to them by the sanctions. The reason why they're doing this, I suspect, is partly because they recognize correctly that this is something that will motivate Trump. He's looking for businesses. While he is arguably destroying the world economy, it may even be more attractive to be able to open up the Iranian market, but also because I think they have come to the conclusion that secondary sanctions relief, which is all that the JCPOA offered, meaning lifting sanctions on non-American companies to do business in Iran, is only sustainable if there also is primary sanctions relief, meaning that American companies can go in. Because once American companies are in the Iranian market, it is more difficult, not impossible, but far more difficult for the next president to just reimpose sanctions. When there are no American companies there, and all you're doing is punishing European, Russian, and Chinese and Indian companies, it's not that difficult for the next president to reverse and reimpose the secondary sanctions. And certainly not difficult for Congress to move in that direction. They would do so with joy and glee. But once you have American companies there, particularly if you have oil businesses doing investments in the oil fields in Iran, then you will actually have a relatively formidable lobbying force that would defend those economic interests and push back against any future president wanting to reverse those that sanctions relief. And that is probably the best guarantee the Iranians can get. But beyond the guarantee, it's also what's necessary in order to make sure that the secondary sanctions relief actually is functioning. Because even if the Biden administration had lifted secondary sanctions, and even if it was, going to be there for 3 years, European companies would still not go into the Iranian market. So they need to have the safety of knowing that what they're doing in Iran is no different from what the Americans are doing in Iran, in order for them to feel that the political risk has diminished significantly. And the fact that the Iranians are now dangling this, in my view, further increases the likelihood that there will be a deal, because it makes the sustainability of the deal greater, and it is something that Trump is truly interested in. It probably would not have worked at all with Biden. I know for certain that it was not a factor in Obama's considerations at the time of the JCPOA. But we're in a different world right now, and it's very fascinating that even the Iranian hardliners have changed their position on this. So it's going to be very interesting to see how that factors into the conversations, direct or indirect, in Oman this Saturday.
Larry, 2 points. One of them is the history of negotiations between Iran and the United States. And the second would be the way that Witkoff is capable of doing the negotiations. As Ambassador Freeman and Trita both mentioned, that Witkoff is a short history of negotiations with the ceasefire between Palestinians and Israelis, and with the case of Ukraine. How is that going to be perceived by Iranians?
I think we're at a situation where we have the only member of the Trump administration that I've observed who seems to have the mannerisms, the what do you want to call it, the equanimity, the speaking skills. He puts English sentences together in a correct fashion to do this. I agree with Ambassador Freeman that he doesn't have the history, the knowledge. He doesn't have the experience with regard to the Iranians, and that's a shortfall. But I have to conclude that the Trump administration has not divested itself completely of the experts and others around it, around the National Security Council staff, for example, at the State Department, that Witkoff has not had opportunity to avail himself of some of that advice and some of that information. And so I'm roughly confident that he might be able to handle it fairly well. Let me say this about some of the previous comments that were made. I'm somewhat at a loss as a military professional as to why we would move B-2s to Diego Garcia other than as a part of threat. Because B-2s can fly from Whiteman Air Force Base. They did against Baghdad. They took two 2,000-pound satellite-guided bombs and dropped them on Dora farms and killed 33 civilians, as I recall, rather than decapitating the state of Iraq. But they have long legs, so they don't have to go to Diego Garcia. And frankly, as the military will tell you, they're vulnerable on Diego Garcia because there are no defenses there. And Iran has missiles that could range Diego Garcia. I don't think for a moment that they would do something like that, except maybe responding to an attack. But it doesn't make any sense unless you're looking at it from the perspective I explored with you the other day, that we're trying to build maximum negotiating leverage before we go in and not actually get ready for a war, which everyone else is interpreting the movement of the B-2s to Diego Garcia as being indicative of. I don't think that's the case at all. It's just the massive buildup that Trump wanted in order to gain negotiating leverage from the perspective that he thought. And then the other point I would make is, I agree with what Trita said there. I think we have a process, Nima. The process has been adumbrated, murdered, slaughtered in its crib, or whatever you want to call it, with regard to our democracy. The process is to put the agreement before the Senate of the United States and give it treaty power. Give it the value of a treaty. It has to be obeyed. It is domestic law and international law for the United States when a treaty is ratified by the Congress. And he owns the Congress now, for the most part. So let's take this agreement and let's assure the Iranians that it is not going to be subject to who's president, because it's going to be ratified by the Senate of the United States. That's the methodology our founders set up for us. That's the methodology that should be used. And if I own the Congress the way Trump owns the Congress right now, look, 15 voted to stop the arms sales to Israel, I think. This is incredible. It's a shame that only 15 voted, but that shows the lock he has on the Congress. So let's give it the power of treaty. You know, we haven't passed a treaty in ages because of the dysfunction of our Congress. we couldn't even get the Law of the Sea Treaty to go through. We had a list of treaties pending ratification that went down a whole sheet of typewritten information when I was at the State Department. So let's back this up. Let's create our democracy once again and make it function. And let's have it before the Senate and ratified. That's the way to give the Iranians the assurance that this is not subject to presidential administration change. And I agree with what Trita said about other things we need to do to make sure that these talks are productive rather than unproductive. And one of them is business and sanctions.
Could I just make one quick comment on
Trita.
what Larry said? I mean, Larry is, of course, absolutely right. This is the process that has been put in the Constitution. This is what we should be doing. Unfortunately, our system is so dysfunctional right now. I don't think there's been anything passed treaty-wise in the Senate for quite some time. Obama did not opt to make it a treaty with the JCPOA because he knew he wouldn't pass. It would be too difficult. We also have the example of a treaty being ripped up by Trump. There was a 1955 amity treaty between Iran and the United States that Pompeo ripped apart with absolutely zero consequences or opposition. So I think we also should be recognizing that given the dysfunction, it seems like even treaties can be ripped up without much of a consequence these days.
If it's that bad, though, we're in serious deep kimchi.
I think we are. I note that there was a United Nations Security Council resolution endorsing the JCPOA and the sanctions relief, which we've ignored. There is a genocide convention, which actually requires positive efforts to prevent genocide, which we've ignored. The World Trade Organization was created by treaty, and we've ignored that. So I don't think this has very much credibility. And I really liked Trita's point, which I thought that is engaging business, because I think that's both realistic and a strategy. And neither realism nor strategy have characterized our relationship with Iran in the past. It would be refreshing to see some sort of strategic thinking about this. But I also have to say, Trita, that you must yourself accept that there's a certain irony in talking about opening up Iran for business and we're shutting ourselves down to the world. I mean, we've basically declared economic war on the entire world. Well, Iran could be the exception, but I wouldn't hold my breath, frankly.
Well, we've been in this state of prolonged...
once the business is roaring and going, we'll put tariffs on.
That's true.
We're in a state of prolonged celebration of contradictions, and it's been going on for some time.
Ambassador, when it comes to the negotiations, my concern is the way that Witkoff is capable of doing. Do you think that he's going to use the diplomats in the United States, that they're so much deep in the terms of the way that the relationship between Iran and the United States work, or he's going to do it by himself and his team?
I think there has been enormous incapacitation of the government in many spheres, and the foreign relations functions of the government are no exception. And I don't know how deep the expertise on Iran really is in our diplomatic corps. It's been a long time since we had people who were sensitive to Persian culture, who understood it, who were well versed in the history, and who had a favorable, or at least were able to put on a big smile when talking about Iran or with Iranians. We do not have an equivalent of Zarif. We do not have an equivalent. He understands the United States very well. I don't know how well Iraqi understands the United States, but I don't see a comparable bench on our side at this point. And I see no indication that Marco Rubio has in fact done anything at all to strengthen the diplomatic function, quite the opposite. So I would like to share Larry's confidence that Mr. Witkoff has ample staff support, knowledgeable, competent, experienced staff support, but I'm frankly skeptical. So we're basically depending on Mr. Witkoff, who is an intelligent man, who is apparently a good negotiator, and who learns. He's shown that. He's been condemned for learning more about Ukraine than he was supposed to. I think that's really, everything hangs on him at this point, and then on the internal divisions of the Trump administration, where I don't know who agrees with Mr. Trump that there should be a deal. His subordinates don't seem to have that view. They want to pound Iran.
Trita, is that of concern for Iranians, in your opinion?
That
the level that the negotiators on the part of the United States are capable of deepening into the negotiation.
So I think it was interesting that in his interview with Tucker Carlson, Witkoff did say that it's going to be a very complicated negotiation because it's going to be very technical. And this further reinforced the idea that this is going to be a verification and inspections-based deal that they're seeking. If it was Libya, it's not particularly technical, and verification is rather limited. And if you recall what happened in the JCPOA, there was a point in which the negotiations became too complex technically for Zarif, for Kerry, for the whole team, and they had to bring Salehi in from the Iranian side and Ernest Moniz in from the American side, as well as other extremely skilled technical negotiations, because we're talking about individuals who actually all know more or less exactly how to build a nuclear weapon. So it's not surprising that the administration then obviously would end up having to end up in a similar scenario in the future negotiations if it is a verifications-based approach that they are pursuing. So if even Zarif and them had to take in those technical people, this team will have to do that as well. And I don't see that as necessarily being a problem, unless by then we don't have a Department of Energy, or we don't have a Department of other things that are necessary for this. But this will be so technical that even in the past, you had to bring in completely different people because of the technical level that was required.
I'm not volunteering, but I did take a course in how to build a nuclear weapon so that I would be able to detect others doing it. Unfortunately, in New Hampshire, where I now live, I do not have a basement in which to apply my knowledge. And I have no interest in flying to Oman. But I think the serious point here is this is obviously, in the best case, this is an initial meeting. It will not resolve the issues. It will create a process for a negotiation. And if that is enough to satisfy Mr. Trump, then I think I strongly endorse Larry's very wise comments about the significance of the B-2s in Diego Garcia. I'd note that there's another element here which is rather interesting, and that is that the aerial tankers were originally at Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, and it's pretty clear that Qataris don't want anything to do with a war with Iran. I don't think anybody else in the Gulf Cooperation Council does. So whatever happens here, there's going to be a bit of fallout in the region. The Gulf Cooperation Council is already looking at the American treatment of European allies and NATO, and wondering whether it shouldn't do what the Germans are doing, that is, reorganize itself to have a more effective self-defense capability rather than relying on the United States. There is a mechanism for that called Peninsula Shield, but it's basically been more of a farce than a force, for the simple reason that arms purchases in the Gulf tend to be motivated by the level of rake-off rather than the utility of the weapons involved. And you have 6 greedy leaderships in the 6 countries of the Gulf Cooperation Council, all looking for graft. So can they overcome that? Theoretically, they could. But I think we've seen a trend there. Iran may in some ways have been the forerunner for this globally, with the Islamic Revolution ending Western tutelage of Iran, a proud country and civilization. We're now seeing efforts by the Arab countries of the region to diversify their own international relationships to the extent they can. Their problem is there is no other country beyond the United States with the capacity to come to their assistance militarily if they get in trouble. But on the other hand, they're also now seeing that the United States can get them in trouble for reasons that they don't agree with and on behalf of interests that they don't share. So I'm not sure where all this is going, but it's very clear that the contours of the Persian Gulf Security Order are in flux.
Nima, I'd like to add something to both what the ambassador and Trita said or implicated. I think Moniz was absolutely crucial to the JCPOA. And I don't see anyone like that, despite my previous statements about there being expertise in the government. I don't see anyone like Moniz with the kind of negotiating skills that he apparently had. I did a little bit of work for Obama on the JCPOA, and the kind of command over Kerry that he had with regard to Kerry letting him go and letting him deal with what he had to do, and his counterpart on the Iranian side. That's key to any kind of agreement that's going to be enforceable to the extent that Trump will be happy about it and the Congress will be happy about it. Not happy, but at least content. And I don't see that kind of expertise. So I think that is a problem that Witkoff is going to encounter.
You don't want to bring Doge to the rescue?
You could pick up the whole Nuclear Regulatory Commission. And I remember when we were working with reprocessing facilities, Sig Hacker and other physicists with regard to Yongbyon in North Korea, and how complicated that got, even in terms of just having a reasonable inspection and determining what was happening. It's not easy.
No.
Trita, we know that Russia and China were part of JCPOA, and yesterday, Iran, Russia, and China had a meeting on talking about Iran's nuclear program. The United States tried to put pressure on Russia, China, and Iran, which is bringing all of them together. And right now, there was a meeting. What are they talking about? What is the main goal on the part of Russia and China, in your opinion?
I think part of it is that the Iranians want to keep the Russians and the Chinese sufficiently abreast of what is happening in order to ensure that there is no sabotage happening from their end. I don't think they're too worried about the Chinese, but with the Russians, there have been challenges in the past, including during the JCPOA. And I think we're dealing with another factor here that wasn't as much of a problem in the JCPOA talks. In the JCPOA talks, it was originally a bilateral agreement between the US and Iran, secret talks in Oman. But then it was expanded to the full P5+1. Even that brought it along some tensions. But then it was a complicated negotiation with all parties at the table. Trump is going to cut out the Europeans entirely, and he's going to cut out the Russians and the Chinese to a large extent as well. He's going to make a bilateral deal. He's not in the process or in the mood in general of doing these larger multilateral deals. And frankly, there isn't even time for it. The snapback sanctions expire in October. If you have some sort of a massive 6-7 party negotiation, it's just not going to be able to make it in that time frame. The Europeans are obviously going to be very upset that they're cut out of this, but they were cut out of the Ukraine talks as well. So this is a much smaller blow to them compared to being cut out from Ukraine. But all of that is going to increase concerns about not necessarily full-scale sabotage, but complications that some of these countries may throw into the mix precisely as a way of inflicting a cost for them being excluded. And I think the Iranians are a bit worried about what the Russian element here could end up being. So they want to keep them close enough in order to make sure that they keep a track themselves of what the Russians are doing this. You would note, for instance, that it's within this time frame that the Russians also came out and said that their agreement with Iran does not entail that they would come to Iran's defenses if the United States were to attack.
Ambassador, we've learned that the United States, New York Times reported that the United States is just moving their weapons from the Pacific to the Middle East. And how many people are arguing, some experts are arguing that if something happens, something big happens in the Middle East, that would benefit Russia in terms of the oil, and that would benefit China in terms of the conflict that China has with the United States in Taiwan. But after all, when you look at the strategy on the part of these two countries, do they really think of it? Because what is the bigger picture for them?
I think the bigger picture for them is that they want a stability. In the case of the Russians, to their south, they do not want the region to blow up. They have a Muslim population of about 15%. They've had serious problems with Islamic terrorism, and they don't want a repeat of that. They want to have a good relationship with the powers in the region, rather like the Chinese. They are trying to maintain a good relationship with everybody rather than taking sides. I think their relationship with Iran is correct, and their relationship with Russia are both correctly described as ententes, meaning limited partnerships for limited purposes, although the purposes and the limits seem to be loosening as American pressure drives them closer together. I think that Trita is absolutely correct to note that the Russian partnership with Iran does not include a defense commitment. It includes cooperation in helping Iran to develop a more robust defense, which is important to Iran. As far as the Chinese are concerned, yes, they are very concerned about their oil supplies from the region. They have, in a strange way, emulated the United States in bygone days. Their only real interest in the region is access to its energy supplies. They're not prepared to make a security commitment or take sides between anybody. In fact, they were helpful in completing the process of rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Iran that began with Iraqi intervention and extended to Oman and then was completed by the Chinese. So I think neither Russia nor China have a sufficient interest to want to become directly involved in this, and they will therefore maintain their distance. There is another irony here, of course, and that is that it was Lavrov who, I understand, introduced the idea of the snapback, which empowered the Security Council veto to block sanctions relief. And the Russians continue to take the Security Council rather seriously, as do the Chinese, but we don't. And at what point does our indifference to international law, the UN Charter, and the United Nations Organization and its authorities lead to others ignoring that? In other words, you're talking about a snapback under what circumstances? If sanctions relief is in fact vetoed, what happens then? Do the Chinese and the Russians just go along with that when we are not following any course of deference to the Security Council ourselves? I think this is an open question. We really are destroying the world that we helped to create after 1945. And I don't think the process of destruction has necessarily run its full course.
I think Ambassador Freeman is completely correct on that, and I think it's disaster what we're doing to international law, international humanitarian law in particular, what we're doing to the United Nations. And I was shocked this morning. I'll just point this out. I had no idea that it was this high and even going higher. The webinar I was on with regard to Korea, 90.6% of China's oil and oil products, that's crude and refined products, came from Russia last year. And the percentage is climbing now, maybe as high as 95% before this year is out. So clearly the Chinese don't have as much concern about the Strait of Hormuz as perhaps they did before. That really surprised me that dependency or that situation existed.
They have always taken the position that the proper way to secure the Strait of Hormuz is through diplomacy rather than through the deployment of military forces. For a long time, they were happy to depend on the United States Navy to protect freedom of navigation. But of course, the United States Navy is now their principal adversary, and talking about closing the Strait of Malacca, Strait of Hormuz, Lombok, other routes between not just the Persian Gulf and China, but Angola, Nigeria, and other producers of oil in southern and western Africa, which also supply the Chinese. But there's no interest in the part of the Chinese in going military, even though they have carried out joint exercises with the Russians and the Iranians, naval exercises in the Arabian Sea and in the Persian Gulf.
Well, you remember that, Ambassador, you remember that petroleum disruption exercise we did in 2009, I think, in Beijing?
Yep.
What a different world today. I mean, remember how the Chinese had to go up and go back consult with their MOFA before they made that last decision?
Yes, we do.
We were all redistributing oil all across the planet. No longer.
Nima, can I add something about the multilateral system and
Go ahead.
the very correct comments about how costly it's going to be for us in the long run if we continue to ignore international law and others starts copying this. I've been heading a project here at the Quincy Institute called the Better Order Project. We brought 130 former scholars, former officials, current officials, scholars from 40 countries together to think through the necessary reforms to the security structure of the globe as we transition away from unipolarity. And one of the things that I think was very important that came out of all of this is to understand that when we've been talking about the rules-based international order, particularly under the Biden administration, that it really was not an effort to protect the status quo of the post-World War II system. It was in and of itself an anti-status quo instrument to move the world towards essentially a multi-order world in which the rules-based order would become some form of a bloc led by the United States with like-minded states against a future bloc led by Russia and China. And that we would end up in a scenario in which we would have a world with two different interpretations, not just interpretations of law, but we may actually end up having two different sets of laws for these two different blocs, which will make it very different from the Cold War era. And that it's important to understand that it's not just what is happening now under Trump, where we have a much more frontal assault on some of these institutions, particularly if the US ends up removing itself from a large number of treaties, but also under the Biden administration, we were hollowing out the multilateral system, international law, trying to replace it, a law-centered world with a rules-centered world. And the distinction there is really important because rules are something that we are just making up amongst our close friends, and then we're expecting everyone else to follow them. There's no objective process for rules to be established, whereas laws have objective processes, but more importantly, they're consensual. You are bound by the treaties you sign, not by the treaties you don't sign. Whereas with the rules, the US was essentially moving towards saying, we make the rules and everyone else has to follow them, whether you consent to them or not. And that would have been a very dangerous development if it had continued. Of course, now with Trump, we're doing something else that is also highly problematic. But I think we should be very clear. What was done earlier on was in some ways more dangerous because it was more clever, more subtle, but very much hollowing out and undermining the multilateral system as well.
I agree. And I think it's important to note, Trita, that in addition to claiming the right to make the rules, we claim the right to exempt ourselves from them.
Yes.
So this was essentially a dictatorship rather than anything in remotely responsive to consensus or democratic processes. I think, if I may add one final thought, I agree with you about what was happening in the Biden administration. And it became apparent that essentially the G7 was attempting to, was basically creating a citadel into which we would retreat, and the rest of the world would be out there in the jungle, as Joseph Borrell unfortunately said. But that's gone. because the United States and Europe are now at odds on a whole bunch of issues.
Mhm.
And our leadership of Europe is no longer intact. It has been displaced by a European fumbling process looking to become strategically autonomous. So the citadel itself is cracking into parts. And I think we're in for a world that was well described in the Melian dialogue Thucydides wrote about, where the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. And there's no overarching authority, moral or otherwise.
And my grievous concern from a military professional's point of view is that we are not the giant we think we are.
Right. And in fact, just today, this morning, actually, in terms of our intent to impose backwardness on China, there were two interesting developments. One is the Chinese apparently have independently invented an extreme ultraviolet process for making microchips down to the 2 nanometer level. And second, they have created a single layered, metal chip at the 1 nanometer level. So exactly what was predicted to happen did happen. That is to say, if you tell people you can't have things, but they know more or less how they're made, they learn to make them themselves. And sometimes they invent more effective, cheaper processes of producing what they want than you offer.
Same thing's true in the battery world now, too.
Of course, many areas of technology,
Yeah.
We're no longer the leader. That is, and I don't think you can restore American leadership with either protectionism or closing the door to cooperation in science and technology with other countries, which is essentially what we're doing as we dismantle our universities' excellence and destroy them as talent magnets for the world, leaving NEMA as the only talent magnet at your university in Brazil.
Trita, what are, in your opinion, right now in Iran and with the government of Iran, with the team of Arakchi, the foreign minister of Iran, what do they want to achieve with these negotiations? What are the main points on the part of the Iranian government to be achieved?
The Iranians are in a tough position. Their economy is in a very bad shape. They have been weakened in the region. They are stronger on the nuclear front, which oftentimes is forgotten here in Washington. We're only looking at the fact that they're definitely weakened in the region. But they're also dealing with tremendous internal problems and a lack of legitimacy of the government. They desperately need to be able to deliver something to the population, and sanctions relief is essential. And we have to remember that the nuclear program, starting all the way from the time of the Shah, had essentially two purposes. One was that they needed nuclear energy. It was the United States that convinced the Iranians that you cannot be a great power without having nuclear energy during the 1960s and 70s. But also because they know they're going to run out of oil at some point and they need to make sure that they are energy dependent and an energy exporter in other means. But secondly, because they needed to have, in their view, an option to be able to go towards a nuclear weapon, an option that they so far have opted against because it does carry with it a lot of negatives for them strategically. But we're at a moment right now in which, because certain changes in the region has changed the calculation of a lot of folks within the system. Many people who were very much in favor of the JCPOA before are increasingly shifting and believing that actually Iran needs a nuclear weapon. And part of the shift there is because of what the United States did under Biden and continues to do now under Trump with Israel and Gaza. I think the Iranians were in for quite a shock. They did not believe that the United States would allow Israel to be completely unleashed, conduct a genocide, and not only not do anything to stop it, but fund it and arm it and protect it. I think that really took them by surprise. And made them realize that they're in a much, much worse and more dangerous situation than before. And I think the similar thinking has happened on the Saudi and GCC side, in which they thought that their relationship with the United States to a certain extent would be a way of protecting themselves against any potential problems with Israel. And I think they've come to the conclusion that push comes to shove, the United States is not going to do anything to protect them. It will do everything to protect Israel, to do whatever it wants to do. That's the impression, the conclusion that many have drawn. And under those circumstances, the calculation as to whether it is worth the cost to move towards a nuclear weapon route has shifted for many. And in conversations I had last September with officials from Iran, I was left with the impression that the time pressure they were on to try to get a deal, because those people are the ones who still believe in a deal, is not just because of the snapback expiration in October and all of the state of the economy and the absolute need for sanctions relief. It's also because it's the last chance to get a deal before the opinion within the system changes so dramatically that Iran no longer will be interested in a deal, but in fact will lean towards finding a way to get a nuclear weapon. A debate that in the past, those voices were a clear minority, were not in a strong position, but it has shifted dramatically. And just to add an additional fine point to this, that's the situation that's changed globally in many ways, because now you have Germany, Poland, even Sweden openly talking about building nuclear weapons. And those are states that are in Europe. They obviously view themselves under threat because of Russia, but Russia has not attacked any of them recently, which we have to go back decades before that happened. They've attacked Ukraine, of course, which is not a minor issue, but nevertheless, they've not been attacked themselves. Iran has been attacked twice now with missiles and bombs from the Israelis, and of course, it attacked back as well. So it's a very different situation. And I think that it has changed the calculation in a very significant way. It has not yet shifted it entirely, but it will in the next couple of months, perhaps a year, unless something happens on the nuclear front.
And Dima, just to add to that and broaden it a bit, the progressives and the conservatives in turmoil right now in South Korea have elections coming up on 3 June. And I asked the question, and I got, I think, an accurate answer. Both parties are going to probably pursue reprocessing facilities and nuclear apparatus. They aren't going to go to a bomb, but they want a latent capability. This is a very dangerous development in the world, all across the world, I think. I thought we had killed it with the destruction of the AQ-Khan network and what was happening there. But we're back in a world where people are considering, states are considering the utility of having at least a latent nuclear capability, with South Korea being one, and as Trita just pointed out, the Iranians being another. And you can hardly, given the circumstances they exist in, blame them.
Ambassador, we know that one of the main issues with Netanyahu and Donald Trump would be the case of the axis of resistance. They're trying to do everything to bring that case into the negotiations with Iran. How do you see the Iranian response for that if they try to do that?
I think they'll need a firm rebuff. Of course, there's not that much left of the axis of resistance, so-called, in terms of capabilities. Hezbollah has been decimated. Syria has been devastated. Yemen continues to stand its ground, and I think it will continue to do so. It is backed by Iran, but not directed by Iran. And of course, Hamas, we're told by the White House, everything that happens in Gaza is the fault of Hamas. So when there's a gangland-style execution of aid workers or medical personnel, this is the responsibility of Hamas somehow. So I think the basis for an understanding on this is not there. First of all, the American characterization of the relationships between, let's say, Hezbollah and Iran, or the new regime or the former regime in Syria and Iran, or the Ansar Allah, the Houthis in Yemen and Iran, or Shiites in Bahrain and Iran, is cockeyed. It is not realistic.
And we essentially joined Israel in its IDF's indiscriminate bombing of Gaza by our indiscriminate bombing of Yemen.
Exactly.
We're as guilty as they of just doing things because we can do them. The old Thucydides Melian dialogue business. We're powerful. We can bomb you.
You see the level to which we have sunk this signal gate breach of communication security by the Trump team includes a segment which is clear evidence of a war crime. Namely, they rejoice at bringing down an apartment building with 53 people in it in order to get one guy. These are all civilians. This is a war crime. And yet there's no reflection of that in our press, no reflection of it in our politics, and it's barely noted even abroad. We have come to a point where we lack moral standing, and we don't seem to realize that we have reached that point.
Trita, your take on Iran's position on the axis of resistance.
Well, I mean, first of all, it is clearly weakened. I think much of that strategy has been in shambles, and to a certain extent is actually because of Hamas. The Iranians are not very public about it, but they're actually very angry, and they were earlier on as well, because the Iranians were playing the long game. Hamas had at one point approached them and wanted to get support for an attack, and the Iranians had rejected it. Hezbollah had rejected it. Hamas went ahead and did it anyways on their own without any coordination. And then brought about all of these different consequences that we see now, including for the Palestinians themselves. But it really collapsed the Iranian long game strategy, and now they're paying the price for that. But it also means that once Iran lost Syria, it increased the need they had for Hezbollah, for the Houthis, as well as for a potential nuclear deterrence. So, you know, if you have, and Hamas was never much of a part of Iran's security doctrine, but they had these different groups, of course, Hashd and other groups in Iraq. If they're all weakened, whoever remains become more important, but also the nuclear deterrence becomes more important, which again goes back to what I said earlier on, a shifting strategic calculation that they have. And this is one of those things that I think from a Trump administration perspective, they need to really think through very carefully. If they want to throw in missiles and they want to throw in Iran's relations with some of these groups as part of the negotiation, and they want dismantlement on all fronts, first of all, that's a complete non-starter, because you're essentially saying that Iran, in that neighborhood, in the midst of a genocide committed by Israel, and Israel is completely unconstrained, should agree to get rid of all of its deterrents. That's not possible. But even if you manage to push them to get rid of one of their potential deterrences, you have to recognize that that means the other ones are going to become more important. And you have to then figure out which one are you willing to live with. I would suspect that the conclusion on the American side, if we had a rational process, would be that we would think that, you know, the Iranians are going to have some deterrence. There's no way we can get rid of everything. Which is the one that we think is most important for them not to have, because it could potentially be a threat to the US. And that would be the nuclear issue. And we would not touch the other ones, or at least not trying to eliminate them with some constraints, and other things, of course, is a different matter. But we have to recognize that if we, in the opposite, then go in the direction of saying, you cannot have any missiles, you cannot have any relations with Houthis and others, then we're going to have to live with Iran most likely really rushing towards a nuclear deterrence. So we have to think through the consequences of what we push for here, and recognize that it will have repercussions on whatever other elements of deterrence they have. And they essentially have three: nuclear, missiles, and the various groups that they're allied with in the region.
Trita, maybe you can answer this question. I asked it yesterday and I couldn't get a really good answer. Are we still operating the missile control technology regime? Is that still an operative concept in the world, or is it dead?
I think Chaz would know much more about that. But what I can say, however, and it may not be entirely related to your question, I guess it is, but the Iranians have not signed any treaty that limits their missile program. They're not part of it. whereas they are part of the NPT, and as a result, we have a legal basis demanding that they don't build nuclear weapons because they have legally committed not to do so.
Right.
They have not signed anything when it comes to missiles, and as a result, we're not operating on the basis of some legal standard that they have consented to. And again, it goes back to the rules-based order. Are they beholden by things they've signed, or are they beholden by things that we're making up?
I think the
This
missile,
was Chaz can correct me here if I'm wrong, but this was a G7 invention, I think, and it wasn't necessarily a curb on conventional weaponry as much as it was discussions about ranges and threats and so forth, which would be a, you know, not a panacea, but it would be a solution to some of these other intractable problems with the
I think
insistence.
it's operationally dead, Larry.
That's what I'm.
You know, and I would say, you know, the original, the biggest controversies were in South Asia with the Pakistani missile development with Chinese assistance, and the transfer to Syria of Chinese missile technology, as well as to Iran. Of course, North Korea and Iran have cooperated. But quietly, as I understand it, the obsolete Chinese missiles in central Saudi Arabia were swapped out for more modern, reliable missiles, still maintained by the Chinese. And that is not inconsistent with the MTCR. So I think basically we've just trashed it.
Like the G7.
Yeah, pretty much. I would like to say that, Trita, I think your strategic analysis of the issue of Iranian deterrence is spot on. That was an excellent statement of reality. And again, it points to the need for some kind of American strategic reasoning, which I don't see much evidence of, frankly.
Yeah.
Not just there either, everywhere.
Thank you so much for being with us today, Ambassador Chaz Freeman, Colonel Wilkerson, and Trita Parsi. Great pleasure to have you on.
Thank you for
Thank you
having
so
me.
much, Nima. Great pleasure with being with all of you.